The music was low enough to be ignored, but rich enough to be respected. Duke Ellington sat at his table the way he always did, back straight, hands folded, suit pressed like a promise. He was not performing. He was simply present, and in Harlem, that carried its own weight. The mobster didn't see it. He leaned too far back in his chair, glass raised, voice spilling over the room like it belonged to him. Money had brought him north, and money had always insulated him before. He smiled when he spoke, the kind of smile that assumed laughter would follow. It didn't. His words were dressed as a joke. Compliments twisted just enough to sting. A remark about music, about tuxedos, about knowing when to play and when to be quiet. The table heard it before Duke did, or maybe Duke heard it and chose not to respond. Either way, he didn't move. Around them, the room adjusted without anyone standing. Conversations thinned. Glasses paused midair. Musicians watched their instruments instead of the crowd. Everyone understood something was happening, but no one rushed to define it. That was Harlem's way. You waited to see who would claim the moment. The mobster mistook the silence for permission. He spoke again, louder this time, pushing the joke further, turning refinement into something small. He wanted the table to shrink. He wanted the man in the suit to disappear behind his own elegance. That was the point. Humiliation only works when it's public. What he didn't understand was that Duke Ellington did not sit alone. At the far edge of the room, Bumpy Johnson watched without expression. He had arrived earlier, unnoticed, exactly as he preferred. He wasn't drinking. He wasn't smiling. His attention stayed fixed, not on the mobster's mouth, but on the way the room reacted to it. This was how order revealed itself, through reactions, not declarations. Bumpy had learned long ago that real insults weren't loud. They were strategic. They tested borders. This one wasn't meant for Duke. It was meant for Harlem. The mobster finished his sentence and waited for laughter. None came. A few seconds stretched too long. Something shifted in the air, subtle but final. Even the band felt it, fingers hovering, unsure whether to continue or stop. That was when Bumpy stood. Not quickly, not dramatically, just enough for his chair to move and for the room to feel it. Every man in the room understood this was no longer entertainment. He didn't look angry. He didn't look rushed. He simply rose and began to walk toward the table, carrying the full weight of Harlem with him now, silently, watching closely. If you want more untold stories like this, stories about real power, not noise, subscribe and leave your mark in the comments. Before that night, before the silence in the room tightened and every breath began to matter, Bumpy Johnson already existed as a conclusion. People didn't debate him. They adjusted around him. In Harlem, his name was not spoken with excitement or fear, but with certainty. You knew where you stood because he made sure you did. Bumpy never needed to announce himself. Loud men advertise insecurity. Reckless men invite correction. He understood that power lasted longer when it was remembered instead of displayed. His authority came from consistency, not spectacle. If you crossed a line once, the response was measured. If you crossed it twice, the memory of the first response was usually enough. Harlem moved differently because of that memory. Under Bumpy, violence was rare not because men were kinder, but because consequences were predictable. He didn't reward loyalty with praise. He rewarded it with stability. Stores stayed open. Musicians played without interference. Outsiders were welcomed only if they respected the order already in place. That was the code. Simple. Unforgiving. Duke Ellington represented something Bumpy understood instinctively. Not celebrity. Not fame. Discipline. Duke carried himself like a man who had earned silence instead of demanding it. In a country determined to reduce black excellence to novelty, Duke refused to perform dignity. He lived it. Every suit pressed, every note deliberate, every public appearance a reminder that refinement was not permission, it was ownership. Protecting Duke was never about admiration. It was about boundaries. If a man like Duke could be diminished publicly, then anyone could. Respect, once taken without resistance, spread like rot. Bumpy had seen it before. A joke today became a rule tomorrow. Harlem could not afford that infection. Bumpy's enemies misunderstood him because they assumed power needed validation. They mistook his calm for hesitation, his silence for weakness. They didn't understand that he watched everything, who spoke when they shouldn't, who laughed when they were supposed to look away, who stayed quiet when silence mattered. He remembered all of it. That memory was his real weapon. Men changed behavior years later without ever knowing why. Deals fell apart quietly. Invitations stopped coming. Protection disappeared at the exact moment it was needed most. No announcements. No explanations. Just absence. And absence, when engineered properly, was devastating. Duke Ellington sat at that table not as a guest, but as a pillar. His presence reminded Harlem what it looked like when excellence refused to beg. Bumpy saw that clearly. He knew that if Duke lowered his eyes, something larger would lower with him. That could not happen. This moment mattered because it tested something deeper than ego. It tested whether Harlem still belonged to itself. Bumpy understood that real leadership was not proven in chaos, but in restraint. Anyone could pull a trigger. Only a few could decide when not to. That night in the club was not about a mobster's joke. It was about whether a line, once drawn, would be allowed to fade. And Bumpy Johnson had never allowed that before. The man had a name that carried weight south of 96th Street. Downtown, doors opened for him. Police looked the other way. Money moved faster when he was involved. He had learned early that protection created confidence, and confidence created mistakes. Harlem was one of them. To him, the neighborhood was a stage set. Music, lights, black talent packaged for consumption. He didn't see territory. He saw atmosphere. Somewhere to spend, to be seen, to remind himself that power followed him wherever he chose to sit. That belief shaped the way he spoke, the way he leaned back, the way he smiled while testing how far he could go. His attention kept returning to Duke Ellington, not because Duke responded, but because he didn't. Silence frustrated him. It denied him feedback. So the mobster pushed again, this time letting money do the talking. He waved a bill casually, as if generosity could excuse disrespect. He laughed at his own joke, inviting the room to join him, daring anyone to refuse. No one did, but no one laughed either. Waiters slowed as they passed the table. Musicians adjusted their posture, eyes forward, hands steady. Men who worked for Bumpy didn't look at the mobster at all. They watched the room instead. This was the moment when rules revealed whether they still mattered. The mobster mistook stillness for indecision. He mistook restraint for confusion. He had never learned how quiet rooms functioned. In his world, noise settled questions. Whoever spoke, last won. Whoever raised their voice controlled the narrative. Harlem did not work that way. Every word he added increased the pressure, not on Duke, but on the men who had allowed him to speak that long. Boundaries were not enforced with warnings here. They were enforced with memory. Everyone present knew that. Everyone waited to see if that memory still held authority. Bumpy Johnson did nothing. He remained where he was, unmoving, unreadable. That was not hesitation. It was confirmation. When Bumpy stayed still, it meant he was deciding what this moment would become. He understood that interruption would cheapen the lesson. Letting the mobster continue was part of the process. The mobster leaned forward now, sensing momentum. He lowered his voice just enough to sound intimate, as if humiliation worked better when it felt personal. He spoke about talent, about ownership, about knowing who paid the bills. Each sentence pressed closer to a line he could not see. Around him, the room contracted. Not in fear, but in attention. Conversations disappeared entirely. Even the music thinned, notes stretching longer than necessary, buying time. Harlem was holding its breath. The mobster finally noticed the silence. He paused mid-sentence, eyes scanning faces that refused to meet his. He smiled again, smaller this time, mistaking the absence of response for surrender. In his mind, he had won. No one had challenged him. No one had corrected him. He raised his glass in mock celebration, unaware that the room had already reached a decision. If nothing followed, the message would travel faster than any rumor. It would say Harlem could be visited, mocked, and dismissed without consequence. It would say refinement was decoration, not authority. Men would remember that. They would test it elsewhere. One small silence would become permission everywhere. That was the real danger forming in the room. Not violence, not insult, precedent. The mobster could not see that. He believed survival meant walking out untouched. He did not understand that survival without respect was only delay. As he set his glass down and leaned back, satisfied, he mistook control for comfort. Behind him, somewhere in the room, a chair moved. The kind of sound that changes what happens next. Permanently. Because stories like this don't get told twice, subscribe now. The mobster decided to finish it properly. He stood this time, chair scraping just enough to demand attention, and raised his glass higher than before. His voice carried now, sharpened by confidence and alcohol, aimed not just at Duke Ellington, but at the room itself. What he said wasn't clever. It didn't need to be. It was loud, dismissive, framed as generosity while stripping dignity clean. A joke meant to land everywhere at once. Duke Ellington did not look up. He adjusted his cuff, slow and deliberate, as if timing mattered more than words. The insult hung in the air unanswered, and that refusal cut deeper than any response could have. Dignity, when left intact, exposes vulgarity for what it is. The mobster felt that exposure immediately, and it enraged him. So he pushed harder. He spoke of money again, of who owned stages and who rented them, of how easily elegance could be bought and how quickly it could be replaced. He laughed alone, forcing sound into a room that no longer accepted it. This was no longer miscalculation. It was declaration. Everyone heard it. This was the moment leadership revealed its cost. Bumpy Johnson felt the weight of it settle, without shifting his expression. He knew exactly what retaliation would invite. Italians would demand explanations. Police would sniff opportunity. One visible act could unravel years of balance. Harlem did not exist in isolation, no matter how much it pretended to. But he also knew the other cost. Silence here would echo longer than any gunshot. Men would remember who was allowed to speak that way. They would repeat it, emboldened. Respect would become negotiable, and negotiable respect was already lost. Bumpy had buried men for less. He had also spared men for more. Leadership was never about impulse. It was about choosing which consequence you could live with. Duke remained still, eyes lowered, absorbing the insult without shrinking. That restraint mattered. It removed emotion from the equation. This was no barroom quarrel. This was a public test of order. Bumpy understood something then that the mobster never would. Violence would make the insult unforgettable. Doing nothing would make it acceptable. Neither outcome served Harlem. So he chose a third option. He stood, not to confront, but to correct. The movement was subtle, but the room felt it instantly. Bumpy didn't hurry. He didn't look at Duke. He didn't look at the mobster either. He allowed the space between them to speak first. Silence returned, thicker now, purposeful. In that silence, Bumpy considered what men would say tomorrow. How stories would bend. How absence of chaos could still communicate authority. He knew restraint confused outsiders more than threats ever could. They didn't understand conclusions that arrived quietly. That confusion was useful. It lingered. It traveled. The mobster noticed him at last and smiled, assuming negotiation, assuming posturing. He had seen men like this before, men who wanted to be seen. Bumpy offered neither aggression nor concession. He stopped close enough to be undeniable, far enough to remain controlled. What happened next did not belong to the mobster anymore. It belonged to Harlem. In that quiet, Bumpy made his decision final. He would not raise his voice. He would not embarrass Duke further by defending him loudly. He would not turn the club into a spectacle. Instead, he would end the insult at its source and leave nothing visible behind. This approach carried risk. Outsiders might misunderstand it. Rumors might soften it. But Harlem would understand exactly what had been done. The mobster waited for words. None came. Seconds stretched, heavy and unfamiliar. His confidence began to slip, replaced by the uncomfortable sense that the room had moved past him. He realized too late that attention had shifted, and that whatever followed would not require his participation. What he received instead was attention, focused and exact, the kind that made every previous sentence feel like a mistake. In that moment, the room understood what leadership looked like when it refused to be rushed. The atmosphere hardened, not with threat, but with finality, a decision settling into place that could not be reversed. Every option had carried a cost. Bumpy paid the one that preserved dignity, order, and memory. And the mobster, for the first time that night, felt uncertainty replace confidence. No one intervened. The room accepted the outcome before it was visible. Finally, the test was over. The lesson was about to begin. Bumpy Johnson stopped beside the table without announcing himself. He did not block the mobster's view or demand attention. He simply occupied space that could not be ignored. Up close, his presence carried no threat, only certainty. He spoke softly, low enough that only one man could hear him, and that was intentional. Humiliation worked because it was public. Correction did not need to be. The mobster leaned back slightly, expecting anger, maybe negotiation. He received neither. Bumpy's voice was even, measured, free of insult. He didn't mention Duke Ellington. He didn't reference the joke. He spoke about boundaries, about places that welcomed visitors and places that required respect. Each word landed clean, without urgency, without heat. Then Bumpy's hand moved. The razor appeared as if it had always been there. Not raised, not brandished, just present, held loosely, angled so the steel caught the light for a brief moment before settling again. Close enough for the mobster to notice. Not close enough to touch skin. Distance mattered. This was not about injury. It was about awareness. The room did not react. No gasps. No movement. That absence of response confirmed everything. This was not theater. It was procedure. Bumpy did not threaten the man's life. That would have been crude. Lives ended all the time. They were replaceable. What Bumpy threatened was far more valuable. He threatened the mobster's belief that money erased borders, that confidence that followed him into every room, that certainty that consequences stopped at familiar streets. Here they did not. Bumpy explained this calmly, almost kindly. He spoke of how reputations traveled faster than men, how stories formed even when details were missing, how a man could leave a room untouched and still never be welcomed again. The razor never moved closer. It didn't need to. The message had already arrived. The mobster understood immediately. His posture changed first. Shoulders tightening, breath adjusting. Eyes focusing not on the blade, but on the man holding it. He realized that violence was unnecessary here because the damage would occur elsewhere, later, in ways he could not predict or control. This was Harlem law. Quiet, efficient, uninterested in explanation. Bumpy paused long enough for the understanding to settle, then withdrew the razor with the same lack of ceremony. No warning followed. No demand for apology. Apologies suggested equality. This situation did not. He stepped back, reclaiming distance, restoring the room. Only then did the mobster notice how exposed he felt, how small his voice would sound if he tried to speak again. Power had shifted without a sound. Bumpy turned away without looking back. The encounter was already finished. Behind him, the mobster remained still, glass untouched, face tight with realization. He had not been hurt. He had been corrected. And that lesson would stay with him far longer than blood ever could. The mobster did not announce his exit. He didn't slam a glass or make a final remark. He finished his drink, set it down carefully, and stood with a restraint he had not shown all night. His eyes avoided Duke Ellington's table. They avoided everyone's. He walked toward the door as if nothing had happened, and that was the point. Nothing visible had. There was no apology. Apologies were for men who still believed they were negotiating. This was not a negotiation. It was an ending. The door closed behind him without ceremony. No one followed. No one commented. The room did not release its breath because it never needed to. Order had been restored without disruption, and Harlem appreciated outcomes that didn't require explanation. Moments later, Duke Ellington returned to the stage. He adjusted his jacket, nodded once to the band, and lifted his hands. The music resumed exactly where it had paused, smooth and uninterrupted, as if the night had simply inhaled and exhaled. That continuity mattered. It said more than applause ever could. The performance wasn't reclaimed. It had never been taken. By morning, the story had already changed shape. Some said the mobster left early because he felt unwelcome. Others said he realized he was out of place. Downtown, the version carried fewer details but sharper edges. Men spoke of a quiet correction, of a lesson delivered without witnesses, of a room that did not react because it did not need to. No one mentioned a razor directly. They didn't have to. The absence of specifics made the story stronger. It allowed imagination to do the work. Men who heard it adjusted their plans without knowing why. Invitations were reconsidered. Visits postponed. Harlem became, once again, a place you entered with awareness. That outcome was more powerful than violence ever could have been. No police arrived. No reports were filed. No alliances were tested. Nothing escalated because nothing needed to. Boundaries, once reinforced properly, rarely required repetition. Bumpy Johnson never spoke of the incident. Not to his men. Not in passing. Not years later when the names involved had faded. Silence preserved the lesson. Speaking would have turned it into folklore. He preferred memory over myth. Duke Ellington finished his set to a standing room that did not need encouragement to show respect. He left the club as he had entered it, untouched, composed, his dignity intact. That mattered more than acknowledgement. By the next week, the mobster's presence in Harlem was a rumor that never materialized again. He remained powerful where power already belonged to him. He did not test borders he could not control. And that was the reckoning. No spectacle. No body. No headline. Just an invisible line drawn so clearly that no one questioned where it stood. True power did not need to announce itself. It simply removed options until only one remained. Harlem remembered that. These stories survive because people remember what real power looks like. If that legacy matters to you, like this video, subscribe, and share it forward. Bumpy Johnson was remembered incorrectly by those who only counted bodies. They missed the point. Violence was never the achievement. Order was. In a city that thrived on chaos, Bumpy imposed limits without spectacle, teaching men where to stop before they needed to be pushed. That restraint became his real legacy. Harlem flourished under that discipline. Businesses survived. Music traveled. Culture breathed without asking permission. Bumpy understood that power meant stewardship as much as dominance. He guarded space so others could create within it. That was why Duke Ellington mattered. Duke represented refinement that did not apologize for itself. Excellence that stood upright in hostile territory. Protecting that dignity protected Harlem's future. The story endured because nothing dramatic followed. No retaliation. No war. No headline to flatten the meaning. What remained was memory, carried quietly through conversations and changed behavior. Men adjusted without knowing exactly why. They only knew something had been settled. That was the lesson Bumpy left behind. Power that needs repetition is already weakening. Power that acts once, precisely, and then disappears becomes legend. Harlem learned that silence could be authoritative when it was backed by certainty. Generations later, men still speak his name not to glorify crime, but to explain order. His reputation became instruction, a warning without threat, a reminder that structure survives longer than fear when it is enforced with intelligence and patience rather than excess. Duke Ellington continued to play, unbothered, his music standing as proof that dignity survives when guarded correctly. Bumpy Johnson faded from the moment without fading from memory. His influence measured not in fear, but instability. The viewer is left with the understanding that true dominance does not announce itself. It sets terms and lets others discover them. Respect, once established, compounds quietly. It does not inflate because it is not traded recklessly. That understanding separates legends from men who react. This is why the story matters. Not for the threat, but for the restraint. Not for the blade, but for the boundary it represented. Noise demands attention. Silence commands memory.